Remembering Sophia, consciousness, relationship, and feminine wisdom. Act 1. Soul. What a strange old word it is. But what is it? I know you ask yourselves that question, and so do I. What fact or fancy of our human experience requires such a word? Is it a real thing? Or an imaginary thing? Or some conjunction of both? Or is it no thing? Is it a disembodied precept? A logical construct? A conceptual residuum of theology? Or is it an innate perception of our human lives? If we speak the word in Greek and say psyche, or in German, die Seele, or Latin as anima, do we express anything more or anything less? And why do we often speak of soul with an implied feminine gender? Is this gendering a modern affectation or an ancient perception? Does soul, whatever it connote, include something intrinsically feminine? Is there a relational and experiential issue in this gendering of soul which reaches into the relationships of men and women? Or of women with women? Or of men with men? Or perhaps of each of us with our own flesh? We speak about soul, and we understand so very little about it. A century of talking and writing and therapeutizing and researching and anatomically dissecting and now functional magnetic resonance imaging have only objectified the chaos of our concepts about soul. Soul is elusive. Psychology, soul logics, seems a city of Babel, devoid of common syntax, a multi-threaded tatter of words, theories, methods, debates, and preaching, all simmering atop a hot pot of human misery. Or so it sometimes seems to me as I ponder the scene. And I do reflect upon this scene. I'm in the scene. I'm in the pot with you guys. Psychological and somatic suffering are both parts of my nightly and daily work. They're my business for many years. And I've discovered they cannot be teased apart. And despite all of our difficulty in naming this thing, psyche, soul, understanding it, we do psychology. We enter relationships with other human beings that have therapeutic intent. And sometimes those relationships do actually have therapeutic effect. Therapeutica. In Greek, it too is a feminine gendered word. The art, techne, the art of healing. Healing, another old word. It means to make whole. So how do we artfully help life find wholeness? Can soma, body, and psyche find some union? Is that what part of the wholeness is about? What is wholeness? What is healing? Now, I've been asking myself now this as I approach the end of my clinical career in some not too distant years. What have I been doing all these years working at healing arts? And I've asked myself, perhaps, is this art form of making whole just a fabrication of imagination? An old wives' tale? Is it a myth, a story? Is it a fantasy we cling to amid the inner chaos of our complexes and the inevitability of our somatic dissolution? Can these things be whole or healed?
Did you make that up?
I want to write that up.
Life is a sexually transmitted disease, and the mortality is 100%. Place that into your context of the concept of healing. Over the next 5 months, you have asked myself first and then Dr. Ken Kimmel to address the story of a deific and mythic feminine figure, the storied bride and syzygy of God. She is called Sophia, and then in Kabbalistic lore, the Shekinah. In other times, she knew other names. Her story has traveled on many tongues across 2 millennia. And throughout those ages, the telling of her story has frequently been suppressed or abused. Her traditions have been denounced as an affront to reason and theology and God. Nevertheless, she is part of the whole of our human story. C.G. Jung envisioned that the great task confronting this age was a remembrance, an anamnesis of Sophia. Her remembrance brings into psychology a necessary balance, a forgotten half in the imaginative story of the soul. If there is to be a psychology after the Red Book, as James Hillman and Sonu Shamdasani recently subtitled their book, it will be a psychology, I believe, that must include Sophia. In the last few years since the publication of Liber Novus, the Red Book, the understanding of C.G. Jung's work and of the experiences that were foundational to his psychology has entered a new epoch. My own appreciation of Jung has developed in surprising ways during these last few years. Puzzle pieces collected over decades of study have found their place in a broader picture. And the role of Sophia in Jung's psychology is one of the puzzle pieces that, in these last years, has finally found its home. Publication of Liber Novus has given documentary evidence that Sophia was a central, if long hidden, image within Jung's visionary experience. And thence she entered into his psychology. To comprehend the historical and mythic foundations of C.G. Jung's work, or to contextualize the subsequent psychologies which have been labeled post-Jungian, one must understand both the story of Sophia and the mythopoetic psychology within which her myth took form. But a warning, a caution. Sophia's story is steeped in religious history and seemingly religious language, both Jewish and Christian. My challenge is to tell it without sounding like a preacher. Again. So, in preface Please understand, this is a story about the psyche. A myth consciously understood 2 millennia ago by its first authors as having psychological wisdom. It was not intended to be a history, in the hermeneutic manner in which the Genesis story was taken and is still now oft taken as a quasi-historical event. And it most certainly is not theologics. Nonetheless, Sophia's story does wear outer mythic garments of both a theogony and cosmogony. It is an account of the emanation of divinity and cosmos and life. Together, Sophia and the Shekinah inexorably draw us into the heart of the mythopoetic and visionary heresies anathematized by both Christian and Jewish orthodoxy. She is the forgotten feminine heart that has nearly been excised from Western monotheistic tradition. Over the last 2,000 years, her myth has been deemed a heritage of heresy for reasons. Hers is the saga of a female divinity veiled within the matrix of creation. Sophia appears in this primordial drama as a Syzygian bride of the Logos, of the masculine divine image. She is immanent within the tissue of cosmos. In her story, the singular God, who declares himself the one and only God, the God above all gods, is revealed to be a slanderer and a jealous deceiver. Sophia's saga is fluidly imaginal, and it is naturally psychological. It affirms feminine nature as a constituent of divine wholeness. It intrinsically affronts the phalo-logo-centrism, erected and honored by ostensibly Orthodox theology, particularly in its final Protestant thrustings. And I thank Karen for that word, phalo-logocentrism, and I thank Jacques Derrida for constructing that tumescent, amusing, and all too long word. Yeah. As a result, it is understandable if you have heard little about Sophia in Sunday school or synagogue. But it seems very odd to me that one meets so little discussion or understanding of her myth in psychological discourse, particularly in the Jungian subculture of psychology. Most of you know the myth of Eros and Psyche. It is frequently recited with psychological commentary. It is a key text for analytical psychologists and a rich tapestry of mythic images that impact our conceptions about the soul. About the soul, Eros, and our relationships. Lost is the recognition that this myth is intricately related with the story of Sophia. As Dr. Patricia Cox Miller, who is the Bishop W. Earl Layton Professor of Religion at Syracuse University, and the wife of Dr. David Miller, who's been coming and talking with us. As Dr. Miller pointed out, in her seminal study, which is titled Plenty Sleeps There. Plenty Sleeps There. The Myth of Eros and Psyche in Plotinus and Gnosticism. And Dr. Miller's title plays evocatively with the story of Sophia. Plenty. Plenty sleeps there. In psychological discourse, we've heard far too little about Sophia and her tradition and her myth. And I've wondered if perhaps it is because the tale of Eros and Psyche is a safe pagan myth, a Greek myth, seemingly devoid of relationship to religion. The story of Sophia is tainted with the living blood of religion. The story of Sophia, her story, is central, if counterpunctual, in the origins of Christianity and in Kabbalah, where she appears as the Shekinah. Historically, Sophia's myth was a leitmotif, dividing so-called heresy and so-called orthodoxy. In recent academic definitions of Gnostic mythology, the presence of the myth of Sophia, along with commentary on its themes, has become a definitional criterion. Absent some form of her myth, several scholars of early Gnostic writings have argued that a tradition should not be termed, categorized, or called Gnostic. Thus, in the eyes of theologians and historians, Sophia was the consort of heretics. Logo-centric forms of orthodoxy renounced her as a whore masquerading in an ungodly fiction. The later alchemical writers who honored her legacy noted that she was often called a bitch or dung. She was the despised one, the forgotten one, the rejected one. But in Gnostic mythology, a hermeneutic tradition that embraces an imaginal, visionary, and psychological semantics of myth, Sophia was the woman of light in darkness. She is the syzygy, the divine twin of divinity. She is the mystical sister of the Logos. She is the daughter of light and the mother of life. In Kabbalah, which has frequently been categorized as Jewish Gnosticism, the Shekinah is the bride of deity, the vessel of the divine, exiled in creation. Where did this myth come from? The term or name Sophia, Chokmah in Hebrew, Sophia in Greek, wisdom in English, had appeared somewhat cryptically in Jewish literature for a few hundred years before the dawn of the current era. But around the beginnings of the first millennium, and extending over a period of a century or two, mythopoetic imagination gave an intricate new depth and form to Sophia's tale. Storytellers imaginatively heard her myth. They recorded what they heard, what they imagined. It was a soul voice and a soul story. Those who knew this voice were called Gnostics, knowers. Scholars suggest her story was prefigured by a visionary legacy in Jewish tradition predating the textual emergence of her tale in the first Christian centuries. And that does seem fairly likely. But Jewish tradition was not the singular cultural font of her story. There were no rigid demarcations separating Jewish and Hellenistic and pagan or Egyptian culture in this syncretic era. If one searches for prefiguring motifs of the myth of Sophia, they can be identified in Hellenistic and Egyptian cultures as well. Nonetheless, whatever the historical sources are that are hypothesized, they were only vague prefigurations. They were veiled potentials of plot, the fragments of a yet unassembled puzzle. As recorded around the beginning of the current era, 2,000 years ago, the story of Sophia was, in its intricate totality, a new myth, a new story about divinity and humanity and psychology. The dynamic story of soul. New. Sophia first imaginatively unveiled herself 2,000 years ago. Her story took textual form and circulated coincident with the textual formations of Christianity. Her story was in origins a companion and complement to the foundational story of Christianity that most of you have heard. The myth of God become man. Sophia's story was a complement and companion of that story. They had interrelated psychological meanings, and they were seen by some people in that age as two parts in the whole story of spirit, soul, and flesh, of divinity and humanity. This distant age that first recorded Sophia's myth is well evidenced to have been a visionary epic, an apocalyptic cauldron. And that's what apocalypse means. It means a visionary writing. An apocalyptic cauldron, bubbling with imaginative life. In several cultural matrices, old myths were dying, and a new story was emerging in their stead. This was the historical matrix in which both rabbinical Judaism and Orthodox Christianity took form, or at least had their first roots. And both of these traditions had their heresies, allowing that Gnosis and Kabbalah were often seen as heresies. And these heresies, these two, Kabbalah and Gnosis, had roots in this period, in this same general milieu. Now, the story of Sophia played out in Gnostic traditions of Christianity, and perhaps in Merkaba traditions in Kabbalah. The story of the Shekinah played in the tradition of Kabbalah in Jewish tradition, but the myth was not spoken about openly until medieval times. Whether the Shekinah had an occult oral transmission prior to its medieval development in Kabbalah is a matter of academic and also religious debate. The story was fluid. Imagination was at work with this image. It was staying with the image, shall we say. Imagining, imaging, moving a story forward. Kabbalists claimed, and do claim, the story of the Shekinah reaches back to the beginnings of beginnings. Over subsequent centuries, Sophia appears by name in various Western visionary traditions. In medieval alchemy, she found a sister in the anima mundi, the world soul. She later appears prominently by name during the early 17th century in the Theosophy, Theosophia, Theosophy of Jakob Böhme. And thence in German Protestant mysticism and pietism. Her presence was felt in the occult but influential movement of the Rosicrucians during the 17th and on into the 18th centuries. William Blake knew her name well. Russian Orthodoxy has a long mystical tradition of Sophia. And in the quiet corners of non-Orthodox religion, her story and veneration persists even in this day, this rational, logical age. And C.G. Jung had an intense encounter with her, beginning in 1916, as he worked upon his Red Book. She, Sophia, Do not try to sublate her. Do not try to sublate her. She is not a precept or a figment of logic. Quite to the contrary. She is the bride and syzygy of Logos. She offers our age a forgotten key to perceiving the nature and the mystery of our own soul fact. And I say that not meaning to preach. I'm speaking imaginally, maybe even psychologically. This has something to do with understanding wounds and putting things wounded together, making divided things whole. Sophia in early Jewish textual tradition. The earliest roots of Sophia's story probably date back to around the 4th century, or maybe a bit earlier, before the Common Era. And these are found in Proverbs, which is a book in Tanakh, in Jewish canon, where Sophia is described as a, quote, female figure playing always before Yahweh, after having been created by him at the beginning of his work. In Proverbs chapter 8, she tells her story in a first-person voice. She says, "The Lord formed me from the beginning, before he created anything else. I was there when he set the clouds above, when he established springs deep in the earth, and when he marked off the earth's foundations. I was the architect at his side. I was his constant delight, rejoicing always in his presence." The Wisdom of Ben Sira, which is also called the Book of Ecclesiasticus, was written in Hebrew around the year 180 BC, before the Common Era, but was never accepted as a part of Orthodox Jewish canon. The Wisdom of Ben Sirach describes Sophia as having been created at the very beginning. Sophia is infused into all of God's works. She is described as traversing the entire cosmos. The text intimates that she is a divine immanence within cosmos, within creation. 200 years later, in the early 1st century, both Philo of Alexandria and the unnamed author of the Wisdom of Solomon wrote further about Sophia. Again, the Wisdom of Solomon is not part of Jewish canon. It was written in Greek by a Jewish author who was influenced by Hellenistic culture and Middle Platonic thought, probably living in Alexandria. Both Philo and the author of Wisdom of Solomon agree that to know Sophia was an experience of rapture. The Wisdom of Solomon even describes the event of meeting her with frank sexual imagery. She is the bride with whom one entered the bridal chamber. As David Winston states, and he's the editor of the Anchor Bible commentary on the Wisdom of Solomon, quote, "There appears to be good reason to conclude that the author's highly charged language concerning the pursuit of wisdom and her promised gifts may allude to a mystical experience. Through which, he believes, man is capable of some measure of union with deity, at least under the aspect of Sophia. A mystical experience, a union, a wedding. This is intimated about Sophia, though what that experience may be was never put in word. The image is wholeness, a healing union. So Sophia apparently could reveal herself, and she did. Let me read from the Wisdom of Solomon, written in Greek by a Jewish author, probably around the first decade of the current era. The Wisdom of Solomon. For she is the breath of the power of God, and a pure effluence from the glory of the Almighty. She is the brightness of the everlasting light, the unspotted mirror of the power of God, and the image of His goodness. And being but one, she can do all things. Remaining in herself, she maketh all things new. And in all ages, entering into holy souls, maketh them friends of God and prophets. For she is more beautiful than the sun, and above all the order of the stars. Being compared with the light, she is found before it. He that loveth her loveth life, and they that seek her early shall be filled with joy. He that holdeth her fast shall inherit glory. And wheresoever she entereth, the Lord will bless. They that serve her shall minister to the Holy One. They that serve her shall minister to the Holy One. And them that love her, the Lord doth love. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7. I spoke about early prefigurations of Sophia's myth. These texts are among those prefigurations. They are temporal snapshots of her developing story prior to the Christian age. They document the myth of Sophia at the threshold of its forthcoming revisioning and transformation. And so let me again emphasize this point. Sophia's story underwent a complex restatement in the first 2 centuries of our era. The mythopoetic, religion-making imagination of that time was moving Sophia towards center stage in a numinous drama. A mythological and psychological drama. It was a radical transformation of the God image, imaginatively manifesting itself, working itself into consciousness in that epic. Gnosis, mythology, and psychology. Jung claimed the Gnostics were the first psychologists. However, to understand what he meant, one must comprehend the way in which Gnostic writers used and understood mythology. The imaginative act of hearing story. The experience of imagining mythically, engaging story, and then expressing that mythopoetic vision was a primary characteristic of Gnostic hermeneutic tradition that took form in these first 2 centuries. Dr. Elaine Pagels, in her earliest work on Gnostic exegesis, emphasized that Gnostic writers were working toward a new hermeneutical tradition. Hermeneutics, the art of interpretation, a new interpretive tradition, a new way of looking at these stories. She continues, stating the Gnostics' approach to the Gospel accounts differed radically from those of their theological opponents. Gnostics dismissed as literalism the view of Gospel texts that came to predominate the later Christian theology. Instead of being interpreted literally, Gnostics claimed the Gospel narratives disclose in symbolic language the process of inner redemption. They recognize that to explicate the symbolic truths hidden in Scripture would require nothing less than to develop a new hermeneutical method, a new way of understanding, a new way of seeing. And this is precisely what they have done. End quote, Dr. Pagels. Now this is a psychological, as opposed to a literal or theological way of reading myth, even religious myth. It is, one might venture, a very ancient precursor of what we now call postmodernism. Giovanni Filoramo, professor in Italy, in his History of Gnosticism, explains further. He says, quote, "The Gnostics' mythology is a conscious and reflected mythology. Using pre-existing material, the Gnostic shuffles them round and gives them a new task and purpose, both profound and original." In his classic study of Gnostic imagination and mythology, Guy Strumsa, who's the Martin Buber Professor of Religion at Hebrew University, emeritus now, I believe, Strumsa offers another view on the new Gnostic hermeneutics of myth, and I quote, "Gnosticism was an essentially mythological phenomenon. Indeed, the last significant outburst of mythical thought in antiquity. The last significant outburst of mythical thought in antiquity. This peculiar characteristic of Gnostic mythology, both post-philosophical and post-biblical, implies an essential, if subtle, difference between prior classical and Gnostic myths, which should be emphasized. In other words, there's a difference between classical Greek myths and Gnostic mythology. I continue. One must say that the peculiarity of Gnostic mythology lies in its self-consciousness of being both a mythology and a theology. In opposition to primitive and even early Greek mythology, the Gnostic myths arose in a mental world where metaphysical problems had already been addressed in non-mythological ways. And it arose precisely as a rejection of those ways. The complex statement. Gnostic myth is post-philosophical and post-biblical. It is self-conscious of being a mythology. It embraces mythic statements and rejects the existing mental or theologic approach of metaphysics. The Gnostics' mythology is a conscious and reflected mythology. One might say that the peculiarity of Gnostic mythology lies in its self-consciousness of being both a mythology and a theology. I would change that word theology and say and a psychology. In 2005, Dr. Marvin Mayer, the general editor and primary translator of the international edition of the Nag Hammadi Scriptures, took this even further, asserting that in the Gnostic writings, the story is as much a story about psychology as it is about mythology and metaphysics. A story about psychology. All of these comments are from well-recognized scholars in the field of Gnostic studies, academics. And they are made in several separate works published during the last several years. They support and conjoin with C.G. Jung's independent and temporally prior understanding of Gnostic myth and psychology. Jung and Gnostic psychology. Jung traced the historical lineage and provenance of his psychology back to the Gnostics who had lived nearly 2,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Christian age. That ancestry was important to him. It was essential. And he stated, and I quote, "The uninterrupted intellectual chain back to Gnosticism gave substance to my psychology. And it became clear to me that without history, there can be no psychology, and certainly no psychology of the unconscious." End quote. Speaking of the period following his visionary journey, the foundational experience Jung recorded in the Red Book, Jung explained further, and I quote again, "First, I had to find evidence for the historical prefiguration of my inner experiences. That is to say, I had to ask myself, where have these experiences? Where have my particular premises already occurred in history? If I had not succeeded in finding such evidence, I would never have been able to substantiate my ideas." Analytical psychology is fundamentally a natural science, but it is subject far more than any other science to the personal biases of the observer. And the psychologist must depend, therefore, in the highest degree upon historical and literary parallels if he wishes to exclude at least the crudest errors in judgment. Between 1918 and 1926, I had seriously studied the Gnostic writers, for they too had been confronted with the primal world of the unconscious and had dealt with its contents. End quote. Jung, in later life, spoke of the Gnostics as old friends, and he called them the first depth psychologists. Writing around 1920, while he was still transcribing the Red Book, he said, and I quote again, "We find in Gnosticism what was lacking in the centuries that followed: a belief in the efficacy of individual revelation and individual knowledge. This belief was rooted in the proud feeling of man's affinity with the gods, subject to no human law, and so overmastering that it might even subdue the gods by the sheer power of gnosis. In Gnosticism we see man's unconscious psychology in full flower, almost perverse in its luxuriance. It contained the very thing that most strongly resisted the rule of faith, that Promethean and creative spirit which will bow only to the individual soul and no collective ruling." End quote. The psyche was a source of knowledge, the knowing of the soul. The story heard from psyche moved in history. There are motifs, or archetypes if you wish, that play recurrently in the plot of our story. We cannot untangle or cut that thread. The weaving is not over. The story of Sophia is part of that tapestry, of that cloth. We psychological moderns are not just a mash of complexes, though most certainly complexes are in our mash. We have our personal demons, deities, and myths, our own dead, and our own shadows, and our own soul wounds. But we are also involved in a vaster human story. We are telling it. The story does not just start today. It has chapters. It has aeons. The fact of story, the soul's story, is part of us. And we are the imaginal proscenium. We are the imaginal act. Sophia in Gnostic mythology and psychology. The myth of Sophia appears in several recensions within different, now discovered, now extant Gnostic texts. And each account adds its own variants of plot and interpretive nuance of meanings. To hear the story in all of its complexity, one must listen to each of these separate versions, and we don't have time to do that here. And in reading the myth, it is essential to understand that this is a self-conscious myth. A myth conscious of being myth. Or as Philaramo said, a conscious and reflected mythology. It is a myth reflecting psychology in its primary forms, empirically, observationally. Psychology as imaginal story of soul and of logos. It is not history, it is not theology. It is mythology used as a proto-psychological language, as semantics of soul. Mythology as a proto-psychological language. Do we do that even today? I hear a lot of talk about myths. We use myths as a language. I remember when Dr. Noel Gardner gave his talks on narcissism. What did he have us do in that seminar? We watched some movies, stories. They were pretend stories. They weren't real people. They were made-up stories. But in those made-up stories, we were observing mythology and psychology. Now, they didn't have movie cameras 2,000 years ago. They didn't make movies, but they told stories that had intent to tell us about what the soul was. And it was consciously reflected as such. Gnostic mythology is complex. It played out on several levels. 3 levels. The story of Sophia also follows those 3 levels. To use Jung's terminology, which is in itself an apt hermeneutic language for Gnostic myth, the first level of Sophia's story, the first level of Gnostic psychology, shall we say, resides at a most subtle, intuitive level of consciousness, of conscious perception, and we might call it an archetypal level. The second level works more in the range of what might be called archetypal image, where imagination forms interrelated pieces of story. And the third interpretive level in Gnostic psychology, in Gnostic mythology, and in the myth of Sophia that we're going to be talking about, works at the level of human relationship and the active substrata of psychic forces or complexes and psychoid reality. It looks at the masks that imaginal forces play in story. Archetypology of everyday life, shall we say. The archetypal initial level of the story deals with extremely subtle perceptions about the origins and nature of human consciousness. This first, or pleromatic level as they called it, level of the pleroma, this first level plays poetically like a prologue in heaven. It is staged before time, or cosmos, or befores. It is the beginning and before beginning. The second level is a level more distinctly imaginal. It is mythological and it is symbolic. Gnostics termed this second level of interpretation, and this is a formal hermeneutics that was developed particularly in Valentinian literature. The Gnostics termed it the psychic, soul level, psychic level of interpretation. Here the story details archetypal images ultimately involved in cosmogenesis and in the genesis of our human consciousness. It is a story heard in reflection of the human condition, or the existential facts. The first level, the archetypal level, is just up there in the clouds. It's an intuition. How it relates to physicality is distantly mirrored. In the psychic level, it really comes down to the existential fact of soul. It is psychological to the degree that one allows myth to be psychology. And the third level of this material, of this story, works at a more material level. Or as the Gnostic Greeks called it, the heletic, the earthy level, the material level. The story of the human soul struggling within cosmos. In this level of Sophia's story, there appear striking images of woman, human woman, as agent of consciousness, as agent of enlightening, as agent of awakening. Awakening mankind to fact of soul. So 3 levels. A vast, vague, archetypal level, hardly able to be grasped. A second level reflecting this, which becomes more imaginal, more mythic, more psychological. And a third level, which passes into human activity, human need, human conflict. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the first level, the archetypal level of Sophia's myth. That's where it starts. It starts there and it comes down into increasingly perceptible forms. Gnostic myths give variable accounts of this archetypal prologue, the not time, before time. And many imaginative voices found this theme evocative. And it was embellished differently by different writers. So this is one version. It's my recension. Before beginning was nothing. Or everything. Before time and space, before anything that might be called before or after, there was pleroma. It was fullness, it was emptiness, and it was entirely unapproachable by differentiating consciousness. Essentially unknowable. Jung wrote a Gnostic treatise called the Septem Sermones ad Mortos. He wrote it in his diary in late January and early February of 1916. He subsequently published it in 1916. It's part of the Red Book, part of Liber Novus, later. And in that Gnostic myth, he starts his myth at this point. This is where his Gnostic psychology also begins. And so let me just read you how he started the 7 sermons. Sermon 1. Now here, I begin with nothing. Nothing is the same as fullness. In the endless state, fullness is the same as emptiness. That which is endless and eternal has no qualities, because it has all qualities. We call this nothingness or fullness the pleroma. Therein both thinking and being cease. Since the eternal and endless possesses no qualities, no one is in it, for he would then be distinct from the pleroma and would possess qualities that would distinguish him as something distinct from the pleroma. Bottom line is, this is sort of a hard place to think about, because thinking discriminates. Thinking has qualities. Thinking makes division. None of that applies. So what do you say? It's unknowable. And then it begins. The act. Act 1. I've struggled for years about how to tell this story. I've tried to tell it in a variety of ways, using mythological language or philosophical language or religious language. It doesn't work. None of that stuff I've said before works. And then I was having my last cup of tea before bed, and I started thinking, how would you make a movie of this? I mean, let's stage this. What's the image? How would I film Act 1? Okay? And I thought I was crazy, and I went to bed. Because I couldn't think of anything. And the next morning I woke up, and this is Act 1. So what are the images? What are the stage directions? Where is the set? Where is the setting? But the time for the story is no time. And the place is no place. Everything is at a threshold, at a timeless moment before. A dim half-light reveals and conceals the scene. The distinct but distant voice of a narrator drifts from below. He reads an ancient Gnostic text, the secret book of Jung. The voice speaks. How am I to speak with you about the immeasurable, incomprehensible? For we do not understand these ineffable matters. And none of us knows these immeasurable things. On stage, absolute stillness, a quivering, an eye opens. He sees she is present with him. End Act 1. The fact of this first pair, or syzygy, resides beyond the threshold of human comprehension. This is part of the incomprehensible, unknowable background of consciousness. So do not concretize the image, either conceptually, substantively, or theologically. That is not this. This is not that. Consider it perhaps as a fantasy about the primal origin of human consciousness. Imagine. Fantasize. The gender attributions in the myth are linguistic. They're imaginal. But they are also relational. Go to the threshold of all image and then reach beyond. That is the domain of this act of the story. Nous, in Greek, the primal mind, the vast potential of mind. Nous, the forethought, awoke and found her present beside him in the primordial light on the bridal bed of being. She was with him. The Secret Book of John, one of the most important of early Gnostic texts, and a text possibly as old as the canonical Gospel of John, tells the story this way. His thinking became a thing. She appeared. She stood in his presence, in the brilliance of the light. She is the power which is before the all. It is she who appeared. She who is the perfect foreknowledge of the all, the light, the likeness of the light, the image of the invisible. Image of the invisible. She is the primal thought, his image. She became a womb for the all. Earlier texts, some of which I read you, had already hinted at the story. They told that Sophia was with the Lord from the beginning. Well, this was the beginning. It began when he met her. Each existed in that relationship, that primal meeting, and she was womb for it all. I also have this other image. This is... So these two people here, like he opens his eye and she's there, right? So what does he say? I made you. Is that where it starts? The boy says, I opened my eye, I saw you, so I made you exist by seeing you. Is that how it works? What does she say to him? Baby, you were nothing and everything before you saw me. You get it? The moment of consciousness involved a potential and a realization. I got my hair cut today. You probably can notice this. It only happens 3 times a year. 4 if I'm feeling rich. And I was I've had the same barber. He's Navajo for almost 30 years, and we've had this ongoing conversation now for 30 years. And so today I said, Steve, I'm giving this lecture tonight. So in Navajo mythology, do boys come first or girls come first? And he thought about this a second, and he said, that question doesn't make any sense. Because they're together, aren't they? It's like I can't answer that because it's just like they're always both there. Have you noticed a difference in some Western traditions in how that story is told? Gnostic psychology affirms relation, duality. You are nothing, big boy, and everything, until you met me. She was named in these ancient Gnostic myths epinoia, a Greek word meaning thought or conception. It's a feminine word. The word implies both a thought and the result of conceiving a thought. She, epinoia, was the womb, equal in unlimitable depth to his unbounded breadth. Neither was without the other. What existed before they existed is beyond comprehension, or name, or any expression of language. Language and story start in this relationship. Thoughts and images. Sophia. The curtain drops on Act 1. I'll continue this story in the subsequent acts, which have a little bit more plot and a lot more action tomorrow. Start tonight contemplating beginnings, thresholds. Note that in this myth of Sophia, the beginning makes no mention of creation, of heaven and earth. The biblical story begins with concrete, creational beginning. The first 3 words of Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim, of Genesis. In the beginning, God created. Gnostic psychology and the story of Sophia start with a myth of consciousness awakening. Consciousness awakening to its own duality of relationship. What is this primal relationship? What are the first facts found there, face to face? Perhaps we might see them as a vast potential of consciousness and a vast potential receiving awareness. Or one might put it another way, as in the secret book of John. His thinking became a thing. She appeared. She is the primal thought. His image, thought, image, together. Here is the primal duality, thought, image, thought. And imagination are in relationship. In Gnostic psychology, neither is a secondary creation of the other. They arise together, awake together, and exist together in relationship, even in us. Can you take this down to a depth psychological perspective? You see how these relationships are coming together in this Gnostic psychology. Is it making sense? Consider a dream. Do you consider a dream? A vision? An image? Is it a creation or a gift? Does it simply exist, or did you make it? Did you open your eye and see it, and you made it by opening your eye and see it? Or was it there when you opened your consciousness to it? The psychology treats such issues in different ways. Psychology is no one thing, right? It's multiple things. Are there some psychologies that would see that dream as an epiphenomena of prior events of consciousness? Of course. Are there types of psychology which would look at image as existent, exterior and interior, but not epiphenomenally created? Yeah? Is that a division in psychology? Yeah. Well, Gnostic psychology. The tradition, it's a tradition. 2,000 years of it. And Jung psychology, which identified with that tradition, stands on the relational side. The relational side. And James Hillman, quite clearly, is on that side. So tomorrow morning, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And the differentiation. Since some of us have read Giegerich, I'm going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow morning. Then, before lunch, we'll move to Act 2 and 3 of Sophia's story. After lunch tomorrow, we're going to talk about Zimzum, Kanoma, emptying out. And then we'll finish the day talking about Jung's Gnostic vision of Sophia on January 16th of 1916. That's not exactly the agenda I wrote down because I had not written the lectures when I wrote the agenda. So thank you very much, and we'll entertain any discussion. One other comment. These pictures, do you know who they are? By Marc Chagall. One of the dear members of our group here gave me a beautiful teacup a couple of years ago that had wrapped around it Chagall's picture of Adam and Eve in Eden. I've been sitting for 2 years looking at this picture of Adam and Eve. As I was contemplating this image of Sophia over the last couple of years, I started looking at Chagall's paintings. Chagall is Jewish, of course. He was born in Belarus. Belarus is a small kingdom at the far western and northern corner of Russia up against the Baltic states. It's landlocked. It was a center of Jewish culture. A lot of Hasidim. They're Kabbalists. The spirit of the Shekinah was present in this land, in these people. The fiddler on the roof I showed you at the beginning, that's Chagall. This myth of the Shekinah as the dance and the music and the relation of life just comes bubbling, bleeding, singing out of much of his art. Dear man, Marc Chagall. Through him, there comes a spirit of Shekinah, of Sophia. It's there in his art, it's in his blood, and it was in the land from which he came.